Can you marry my mom? The innocent, high-pitched voice of a 6-year-old little girl echoed through the glittering, marble-floored ballroom, cutting straight through the murmurs of the city's most feared and powerful elites. Every single glass froze mid-air. Every ruthless crime lord, corrupt politician, and billionaire titan stopped breathing. Nobody dared to blink. A tiny child had just asked the most notorious mafia boss in the country to become her father, right in front of hundreds of distinguished guests. Every eye snapped toward Murphy Moretti. He stood frozen in the center of the hall, his dark eyes fixed entirely on the little girl in mended sneakers. Everyone expected the cold-blooded king of the underground to laugh it off, or worse, have them thrown out into the freezing night. Instead, the feared tyrant slowly, deliberately bent his knees and knelt before her on the marble floor. The air on Prince Street smelled of cold, iron, and roasted chestnuts. A bitter wind cut sharp against the ancient cobblestones of Manhattan. Murphy Moretti did not walk slow. He never walked slow. He walked alone through the crowded autumn market without a single guard at his shoulder. That was a dangerous thing for a man with his name. A sudden gust whipped around the corner of the brick building. A heavy mason jar tipped over on the edge of a vendor's quilting table. Hundreds of tiny buttons scattered wildly across the stones. They rolled in every direction like spilled pearls. One polished bone button rolled straight across the pavement and clicked softly against the Italian leather of Murphy's shoe. Murphy stopped dead in his tracks. He did not kick it away. He slowly bent his knees and knelt right there on the dirty street. He picked up the buttons one by one into his bare palm. "Thank you, mister." A small voice broke through the noise of the market. Murphy looked up. A 6-year-old girl was crouched right beside him. She was missing her front tooth. She held out both small hands like an empty bowl. She had no idea who he was. She would not have cared if she did. "This one is my favorite," the little girl whispered, lifting a tiny blue button shaped like a star. "It came from the shirt I wore on my birthday." Quick footsteps slapped against the pavement behind them. A woman's voice cut through the air, ragged and breathless. "Lily." Allie Carter rushed around the corner of the neighboring stall. Sawdust still clung to the coarse canvas apron tied tight around her waist. A dark streak of dogwood stain smeared across the back of her right hand. She saw the stranger kneeling beside her daughter. Her entire body locked up instantly. It was the specific, terrifying stillness of a mother calculating in a single second whether to run or fight. Murphy rose slowly from the ground. He held out the last of the buttons on his open palm. Their eyes collided. It was not instant recognition. It was something much quieter, much more dangerous. It was the heavy silence that falls over two strangers when neither one wants to look away first. Murphy stared at her longer than he had ever intended. There was no fear in her eyes, only an exhausting, stubborn weariness. He turned away without a single word and slid into his waiting SUV. Marco Bianco watched him from the driver's seat. "Where to, boss?" "We're going back to the estate," Murphy murmured, staring out the rain-streaked window. The Moretti estate sat heavily behind a wall of ancient stone on the north shore of Long Island. Marble floors echoed with a disciplined, suffocating silence. Murphy walked into his private study. He hung his heavy black coat on an empty brass hook by the door. That hook had once held his wife's camel hair coat. Isabella was 3 years gone, taken by a bullet meant for him on the blood-soaked steps of a Rome hotel. Murphy kept the hook empty on purpose. An empty hook did not lie. It held the precise shape of an absolute absence. Marco stepped into the room with a thick leather folder tucked under his arm. "The Brooklyn docks are clean," Marco reported in a low voice. The waterfront moved on schedule. Murphy did not look up from his mahogany desk. "Find me someone who works on old wood," Murphy said coldly. "Not the commercial shops. Someone with hands. Someone who takes their time." Marco studied his boss for the length of a slow breath. He knew Murphy never cared about old wood. "There is a small restoration shop in Caring Gutters," Marco said slowly. "Allie, restoration." Murphy stood up instantly. The bell on the leather strap above the shop door jangled a sharp warning. Allie straightened up at her heavy rank bench. She still held a rusted wood chisel in her right hand. She saw him walk through the door. Her face performed the small, defensive trick it always did with strangers. Polite on the surface, utterly exhausted underneath. "Mr. Moretti," she said, her voice flat. "Miss Allie," he replied, giving her name back with absolute precision. From behind the heavy oak workbench, a small head popped up like a spring. "Mama, it's the button man." Lily abandoned her coloring book in a hurry. She ran the length of the dusty shop in her mended sneakers. She stopped right in front of him, suddenly shy for a single microsecond before deciding she didn't care. "You came back," Lily said, her eyes wide. "I came for chairs," Murphy answered. Behind him, the heavy back doors of his black SUV swung wide open. Two massive men in dark coats carried heavy furniture pieces down onto the sidewalk. 6 antique dining chairs, wrapped carefully in protective blankets, were brought inside. Allie walked slowly to the nearest chair and lifted the corner of the blanket. Her thumb traced the top rail before her eyes even registered the damage. She read the wood the way an expert scholar reads an ancient manuscript. "Original joinery," she whispered, her voice softening despite herself. "Cuban mahogany. Nobody has put a screw in this wood in 100 years. 1911, Murphy said quietly, stepping closer to her. "My great-grandfather commissioned the set in Palermo." Allie looked up, her breath catching in her throat. 6 chairs, she said, recovering her professional composure. "Framework rebuilding, seat webbing, and refinishing. It will take time." "Take all the time you need," Murphy replied. Lily was already tugging at the edge of his expensive wool coat. "You have to see my buttons in the shop light." Murphy crouched down to her height without a second thought. He looked at each piece of plastic and bone as if they were priceless diamonds. When he finally stood up, Allie was watching him with an expression he could not decipher. She was waiting for the catch. She was waiting for the moment he realized she was just a broke single mother fighting a losing war against rent and time. Murphy did not give her that moment. He turned toward the door. "I'll come back before the 3 weeks are up," he said. He said it before he had even planned to. Out on the sidewalk, Mako started the engine without asking a single question. Murphy slid into the passenger seat. He looked back at the hand-painted sign above the shop door. He knew, with a sudden cold certainty, that his life had just split cleanly into 2 halves. Before the button shop, and after it. He returned 3 times over the next 14 days. Each time he brought a fabricated excuse. The first time, he wanted to inspect the stripped mahogany. The second time, he brought a faded photograph of a matching sideboard from the old country. The third time, he brought no excuse at all. He simply walked in 20 minutes before dark. Allie was bent over the workbench, her lamp casting a harsh yellow circle over her tired hands. A deep, worried line formed between her dark eyebrows. She was whispering softly to herself. "Measure twice, cut once, don't rush." Murphy stood silently in the shadow of the door. He watched her hands guide a handmade wooden peg into a mortise joint. She used no modern shortcuts, just pure patience, sweat, and skill. The bell above the door jangled softly. Lily burst in from school, her heavy backpack dragging one shoulder down. She kissed her mother on the cheek without breaking stride. Then she trotted over to the corner table with her jar of colored pencils. "Hi, Mr. Murphy," she chirped happily, and went straight back to drawing. Murphy felt something shift deep inside his chest. It was heavy. It was terrifying. It was the sudden, undeniable realization that he no longer wanted to go back to his empty stone estate on Long Island. He wanted to stay right here, in this cramped, dusty room. He wanted to watch this woman fix things that were broken. Little did he know, the outside world was already sharpening its knives. The piece he had stolen would not last another week. The morning rain hammered against the cold iron of the street lamps. The air in Carroll Gardens tasted like wet asphalt and rusted steel. Murphy sat in the back of his black SUV. His dark eyes were fixed on the weathered sign of Allie Restoration. The hand-painted letters looked faded in the merciless gray light. Marco turned around from the driver's seat. "The building management is moving fast, boss," Marco said. "They filed the final eviction notice an hour ago." Murphy did not blink. He reached inside his heavy wool coat. He pulled out a thick manila folder filled with corporate acquisitions and real estate deeds. "She doesn't know yet?" Murphy asked, his voice dead flat. "Not yet," Marco replied. "She thinks she has until the end of the month." "She doesn't?" Murphy opened the car door and stepped out into the freezing puddle. The bell above the shop door jangled a sharp, lonely note. Allie stood at her heavy workbench with a handheld sander. The mechanical scream of the motor filled the small room. Fine sawdust that drifted through the air like gray snow. She did not hear him come in. Murphy stood quietly just a few feet away from her. He watched the way her shoulders tensed under her faded cotton shirt. He watched the dark smudge of oil paint staining her left cheek. She looked up suddenly and cut the power to the sander. The silence rushed back into the room like a physical blow. "Mr. Moretti," she said, her voice tight with exhaustion. "You're here early." Murphy did not smile. He dropped the thick manila folder right onto the center of her workbench. The heavy cardboard made a dull, heavy thud against the wood. Allie stared at the folder. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the sander until her knuckles turned pure white. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it," Murphy commanded. Allie hesitated. Her trembling fingers reached out and flipped open the cardboard cover. The top document was a legal lease transfer. Below it lay a commercial buyout agreement stamped by a high-priced Manhattan firm. Her eyes raced across the legal jargon. Her breath hitched in her throat. "You bought the building," she whispered. Her voice cracked like dry ice. "I secured the commercial rights," Murphy corrected coldly. "Your rent has been adjusted to 0. The back taxes have been paid in full." Allie stepped backward until her hips hit the edge of the heavy oak table. The color drained entirely from her face. It was not the look of a rescued woman. It was the look of a trapped animal realizing the cage had just been locked by a master. "You didn't have the right to do that," she choked out. "I had every right." Murphy stepped closer. "Your shop was going to be seized by noon. Lily would have had no place to sleep tonight. Is that what you want?" "I want you to stay out of my life," Allie screamed. The sudden shout bounced off the low ceiling and rattled the antique tools on the wall. Murphy froze. His dark eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "I am offering you safety," Murphy said, his voice dropping in a octave. "I don't want your safety." Allie slammed her palm against the workbench. Tears of pure humiliation sprang to her dark eyes. She refused to let them fall. She blinked them back with fierce, desperate pride. "I have spent 6 years fixing my own life piece by piece. I fixed my kitchen when the pipes burst. I fixed my car on the side of the highway in the middle of the night. And I built a home for my daughter with my own 2 hands. I don't need a billionaire in a custom coat to walk in here and write a check to make my problems vanish. Because the moment you write that check, I become your project. I become your charity. And I will not be anyone's charity, Mr. Moretti." Murphy stared at her. He had expected gratitude. He had expected relief. He had never expected a cornered, starving woman to throw his millions back into his face like dirt. "Pride doesn't pay for roof repairs, Allie," Murphy said quietly. "Neither does a bleeding heart," she shot back. She reached down, scooped up the manila folder, and shoved it back into his chest with both hands. "Take your papers. Take your money. Take your chairs. Get out of my shop." Murphy did not move an inch. The folder slipped from her hands and slid across the floor, scattering legal pages across the sawdust. "If I leave this shop right now," Murphy said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal purr, "the marshals will padlock these doors within the hour." "Let them," Allie cried out, her chest heaving. "We will sleep in the car. We will live on the street. Anything is better than owing my survival to a man who thinks he can buy a person just because he owns the block." The front door suddenly swung open. The little bell jangled merrily. "Mama?" A small, timid voice broke the heavy electric tension in the room. Lily stood in the doorway. Her school bag was slung over one shoulder. Her eyes darted back and forth between Murphy's stone-cold face and her mother's tear-streaked cheeks. "Why are you shouting?" Lily asked saucily, clutching her worn-out backpack to her chest. Allie's entire body shuddered. All the fierce, blinding anger drained out of her in a single second. She looked down at her daughter. Then she looked back at Murphy. The silence between them was heavier than iron. "Get out," Allie whispered. Her voice had no fight left in it, just a hollow, echoing despair. "Just get out." Murphy looked at Lily. Then he looked down at the scattered legal papers on the dusty floor. He did not pick them up. He turned on his heel, walked out into the freezing rain, and slammed the heavy oak door behind him. Marco was waiting in the idling SUV. Murphy climbed into the passenger seat without a word. He stared straight ahead through the water-streaked windshield. "Boss?" Marco asked cautiously. "Drive," Murphy said. His voice sounded like broken glass. Back in the shop, Allie dropped to her knees in the sawdust. She pulled her daughter into her arms and held her so tight it hurt. She buried her face in Lily's soft hair and finally let the tears break through. She knew she had won the argument. She also knew she had just lost the only man who had ever looked at her broken life and tried to fix it. Little did she know, the forces gathering in the dark outside her shop were not going to give her time to regret it. The Moretti estate blazed with 1,000 lights. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. Expensive champagne flowed like water into crystal flutes. The city's most dangerous and powerful elites filled the grand hall. Politicians, judges, and mafia captains stood in tight, whispering circles. Murphy Moretti stood near the marble fireplace. His dark tuxedo fit his broad shoulders with lethal precision. He was the undisputed king of this dark empire, yet his eyes kept drifting to the heavy oak doors. Then the double doors swung wide open. Allie walked into the glittering ballroom. She wore a simple navy blue dress that reached her elbows. No expensive diamonds flashed on her wrists. No designer labels clung to her frame. Her hair fell in a soft, natural wave around her shoulders. Beside her, little Lily held tightly to her hand. Lily wore her best yellow dress with mended sneakers on her seat. A heavy, suffocating silence swept across the room. Hundreds of elite eyes snapped toward them, like hungry wolves. Whispers cut through the expensive perfume and cigar smoke. Who invited them? Isn't she just a common shop worker from Brooklyn? What is Murphy thinking bringing trash into our house? Murphy Moretti watched from the center of the upper gallery. Her pale, expensive white hair gleamed under the chandelier. Her three-strand pearls rested coldly against her black silk dress. She did not smile. Her eyes were like chips of blue ice. Murphy did not let them stand alone. He walked straight across the polished marble floor. He bypassed the state senators and the crime bosses. He stopped right in front of Allie and little Lily. "You came," Murphy said softly. "You didn't give me much of a choice," Allie replied, her voice steady. Murphy offered his arm. Allie hesitated for a single microsecond, then slid her hand over his sleeve. They walked together toward the center of the grand hall. Every conversation died out completely. The silence in the room became absolute. A senior mafia captain cleared his throat near the piano. The time had come for the traditional family toasts. Silver cutlery tapped gently against crystal glasses. The room held its collective breath. Suddenly, little Lily broke free from the circle. She stepped right into the empty center of the marble floor. She looked up at Murphy with her wide, innocent eyes. She tugged gently on the sleeve of his expensive tuxedo jacket, just like she had done on the dusty street of Prince Street. "Mr. Murphy?" Lily asked clearly. Her small, high-pitched voice echoed off the high marble walls. Every head in the room jerked toward her. Every powerful man and woman stopped breathing. "Can you marry my mom?" The words dropped into the silent room like a heavy stone into a deep well. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. A child had just asked the most feared mafia boss in the country to become her father, right in front of hundreds of distinguished guests. Everyone expected Murphy to laugh it off. Everyone expected him to dismiss the child at the cold veil of his hand. Instead, Murphy did the unthinkable. He slowly bent his knees. He went down on one knee right there on the cold marble. He brought himself directly to Lily's eye level. The room descended into a terrifying, dead silence. "Yes, Lily," Murphy said, his deep voice carrying clearly across every corner of the hall. "If your mother will have me, that would be the greatest honor of my life." Allie's hand flew to her mouth. Her breath hitched in her throat. Across the gallery, Lucia's crystal glass stopped halfway to her lips. It did not shake. It simply froze in the air. The illusion of control cracked right down the middle. Murphy stood back up and looked straight at his mother in the gallery. The declaration was made. The war had officially begun. Okay, it's such leicht. But it's still spaking for a cystic, and it has been toasting in the rush. Oh, if the one of it out. I was again. No one spy my mane. The words dropped into the silent room like a heavy stone into a deep well. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. A child had just asked the most feared mafia boss in the country to become her father, right in front of hundreds of distinguished guests. Everyone expected Murphy to laugh it off. Everyone expected him to dismiss the child with a cold wave of his hand. Instead, Murphy did the unthinkable. He slowly bent his nose. He went down on one knee, right there on the cold marble. He brought himself directly to Limo's eye level. The room descended into a terrifying, dead silence. "Yes, Lily," Murphy said, his voice trailing clearly across every part of the hall. "If your mother will have me, that would be the greatest honor of my life." Allie's hand flew to her mouth. Her breath hitched in her throat. Across the gallery, Lucia's crystal glass stopped halfway to her lips. It did not shake. It simply froze in the air. The illusion of control cracked right down the middle. Murphy stood back up and looked straight at his mother in the gallery. The declaration was made. The war had officially begun. The heavy oak doors of the private library slammed shut with absolute finality. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the ancient stone walls. Dust motes danced in the shaft of dim light filtering through the stained glass. Murphy Moretti sat rigid behind her massive mahogany desk. Her pale blue eyes were cold as winter ice. Her three-strand pearls gleamed under the soft glow of the antique desk lamp. Murphy Moretti stood directly in the center of the dark, cavernous room. His broad shoulders were tense under his dark velvet tuxedo. His dark eyes did not blink as he met his mother's furious gaze. The silence in the library was heavy enough to crush a lesser man. "Do you understand what you did last night?" Lucia asked. Her voice was dangerously quiet, laced with venom. "I understand perfectly," Murphy replied, his voice dead even. "You knelt in front of hundreds of people," she spat. "You knelt before a room filled with every boss on the East Coast. You let a 6-year-old child ask you to marry a common shop worker. You made this family a laughingstock across the entire coast." Murphy stepped closer to the mahogany desk. He leaned forward, placing his heavy palms flat on the polished wood. "She is not a laughingstock," Murphy said. "She is a threat," Lucia hissed, slamming her palm down onto the blotter. "A widow with a child from a broken street in Brooklyn? She has no need in this city. She has no protection of her own. She is a liability that will ruin everything your father built." "She is everything I choose to keep," Murphy countered, his voice dropping into a dangerous rumble. Lucia stood up slowly, her expensive silk gown rustling against the carpet. She walked around the edge of the desk until she stood mere inches from her son. "There is a vote in this family, Murphy. The senior council has not called it in 22 years. They called it when your uncle thought he could run his own crew. If I speak to them by the end of the week, 3 of them will listen. If I speak to them by the end of the month, 5 will. They will strip your title before the snow falls. They will take your seat at the head of this table. They will cast you out into the street with nothing." Murphy looked down at his mother's pristine, withered face. There was no fear in his dark eyes. There was no hesitation in his posture. Only an overwhelming, terrifying darkness that made even Lucia catch her breath. "Try it, Mother," Murphy whispered. "Threaten me all you want. Call the senior council tonight. Strip my title in front of every boss in New York. Burn the entire Moretti empire to the ground. It will not change a single thing. I will walk out of this stone house with nothing in my pockets. I will leave the money, the cars and the territory behind, and I will still find my way back to that little wood shop in Carroll Gardens. Lucia's face turned white as porcelain with absolute fury. Her chest heaved under her silk dress. "You are stirring away 30 years of blood and power," she yelled. "You are spitting on your father's grave for a woman you met 2 months ago, for a child who picked up a button off the dirty street, for a woman who doesn't even want your charity." Murphy turned his back on her slowly. He adjusted the silver cuffs of his shirt. "You spent your whole life marrying for power, Mother," Murphy said quietly. "You traded love for land and respect for bloodlines. Look where it left you, sitting alone in a dark room with your empty throne, surrounded by men who only obey you because they fear your name. I will not repeat your mistakes. Isabella died because she stood next to me on those marble steps. She died because she was born into this world and knew the rules. Allie Carter does not know your rules, and I will kill every man who tries to teach them to her." Murphy reached out and grabbed the heavy brass door handle. "Do not force me to call that vote, Murphy," Lucia whispered behind him, using his birth name like a weapon. "Do it," Murphy said without turning around. "Call every old man on Long Island. Tell them Murphy Moretti has gone soft. Tell them to come to this house and take my chair, and see what is left of this family when I am done with them." He pulled the heavy oak door open. The bright light from the hallway poured into the dark library. He walked out onto the cold marble floor. He did not look back once. He had won the verbal battle against his own blood. He walked down the long corridor toward his private quarters. Marco was waiting near the grand staircase, his hands folded politely in front of his dark coat. Marco took one look at Murphy's face and fell into step beside him. "She called the council?" Marco asked in a low voice. "She will call them before midnight," Murphy replied. "What are your orders, boss?" "Let her call them," Murphy said, pulling his coat from the hook by his office door. "If any man in that room raises his voice against Allie, I want his name by morning." "Understood," Marco said, his jaw tightening. "Where are we going now?" "Brooklyn," Murphy said. "To the shop?" "To the shop." They walked out into the cold night air. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and black. The black SUV purred silently at the curb. Murphy slid into the back seat and stared out the tinted glass. His mind was racing, counting the moves on a board his mother had just set on fire. He knew Lucia would not stop at a family vote. She was a woman who pruned weakness from her life like dead leaves. If she could not break Murphy's resolve, she would go after the source of it. She would go after Allie Carter. "Marco," Murphy spoke into the darkness of the car. "Boss?" "Put 2 extra men on Carroll Gardens tonight. Quiet ones. Men from the old docks who don't talk to my mother's driver. They sit at the corner, and they don't sleep. If a single car stops near that workshop with Long Island plates, I want to know before the engine cuts off." "I'll handle it personally," Marco said, nodding once. They drove in heavy silence across the bridge into Brooklyn. The city lights flickered across the wet windshield. Murphy pulled his pocket watch from his vest. It was midnight. The street in Carroll Gardens was deserted when the SUV pulled up to the curb. The sign about Allie Restoration was dark. The bell hung silent behind the thick glass. Murphy got out of the car alone. He stood on the wet sidewalk under the flickering yellow street lamp. He looked up at the second-floor window above the shop. A faint, warm light shone through the thin curtains. Allie was still awake. He could see her shadow move slowly past the glass. She was folding something, a small blanket, or perhaps a child's dress. Murphy stood in the cold wind. His hands jammed deep into his coat pockets. He felt the heavy weight of his gun resting against his ribs. He felt the heavy weight of his name dragging behind him like a chain. In that quiet moment on the empty street, he made a silent vow. He would destroy his own empire before he allowed the dark world he ruled to touch the quiet light in that second-floor room. He turned back toward the idling car. The war had officially begun, and he was ready to burn down every bridge behind him. The bell above the shop door jingled softly in the afternoon sun. A woman stepped inside the dusty workshop. She wore a long black cashmere coat that did not belong on this tired street. Her hair was pale, expensive white. Her pale blue eyes swept across the room with ruthless precision. Murphy Moretti had come alone. Allie set her wood chisel down on the workbench. Her heart dropped straight into her stomach. She had known this day would come. She just hadn't expected it to hurt this fast. "Sit down, Miss Allie," Lucia said. Her voice was like dry leaves scraping over ice. "I don't have much time," Allie replied, keeping her voice steady. "Neither does my son," Lucia countered smoothly. Lucia stepped closer to the workbench. She pulled a plain white envelope from her coat pocket. "Do you know what happened to the woman who stood in your place 3 years ago?" Allie did not speak. She stared at the envelope. "Her name was Isabella," Lucia whispered. "She was standing on a set of marble steps in Rome beside my son. A man with a rifle was aiming for Murphy. He missed Murphy completely. He took Isabella instead." Allie's breath caught in her throat. "My son does not talk about it," Lucia continued. "I talk about it every single day. Because men like my son carry a target wherever they walk." Lucia slid the white envelope across the wood. "You have a little girl, Miss Allie. A little girl who brings cupcakes to armed guards at a reinforced gate. There is already a photograph of Lily on a killer's phone in this city. And I am not the one who took it." Allie's vision swam with sudden hot tears. She gripped the edge of the workbench until her fingers turned white. "If you love my son," Lucia said softly, "you will leave him. It is the only way to keep a bullet out of your daughter's chest. Take the money in this envelope, buy a shop in another state, and never look back." Lucia turned on her heel and walked out of the shop. The bell jingled once, then the room went dead silent. Allie stood frozen in the gathering dusk. She did not open the envelope. She looked at the small framed photo of Lily on the wall. She knew Lucia was right. Murphy would step in front of any bullet without a second thought, and he would die doing it. Midnight arrived with a bitter, freezing wind. The shop was pitch black. Allie packed 2 suitcases in total darkness. She zipped her tool rolls shut. She left the amber velvet untouched on the workbench. She slipped into Lily's small bedroom at 3 in the morning. She touched her daughter's soft cheek. "Wake up, baby," Allie whispered. "Where are we going, Mama?" Lily asked, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "We're going to visit someone for a little while," Allie lied. Her voice broke on the final word. They slipped out the back door into the empty alley. A cold rain began to fall as the bus pulled away from the terminal. Allie watched the dark skyline of New York fade into the gray mist. She left a single folded note on the workbench for Murphy. "Thank you for staying. Now it is my turn to stay for you by leaving. Please do not look for us." Little did she know the shadows had already started running. The heavy silence of the empty shop pressed down like lead. Every tool hung in its designated place on the pegboard. The wood shavings on the floor had gone cold. Outside, the streetlights flickered against the damp pavement. A black sedan rolled slowly past the darkened windows. Inside the car, a pair of eyes watched the silent building. They had been watching for 3 days. They saw the dim glow of a single flashlight upstairs. They saw the 2 suitcases carried down the back stairs. They saw the taxi disappear toward the interstate. The phone inside the sedan rang twice. A low voice spoke into the receiver. "They're moving." "Which direction?" a cold voice asked from the other end. "Northeast. Track them. Don't lose them. The boss wants them before Moretti wakes up." The sedan shifted into gear without a sound. Its headlights remained off until it cleared the corner. The trap was closing, and the hunted had no idea they were running right into the jaws of the wolf. Back in the shop, the folded note sat alone on the wooden table. The wind rattled the loose pane of glass in the front door. A single button rolled off the edge of the shelf. It hit the floor with a tiny, sharp click. The house was empty. The city was vast. And the countdown to the final collision had officially begun. The morning sun hit the iron lock of the shop door. It was locked, tightly locked. Murphy Moretti stood on the cold pavement. He held 2 paper cups in his hands. One had coffee for Allie. The one beside it had warm milk for little Lily. He had waited all night for this morning. He turned the brass handle. It did not budge. Marco stepped out of the black SUV behind him. He took one look at the closed shop. He said nothing. Murphy dropped the paper cups onto the wet concrete. The hot coffee spilled out, staining the pavement dark. He pulled the heavy master key from his coat pocket. He slid it into the lock and twisted hard. The doors swung open with a dry, empty creak. The workshop was completely dead. The tools hung silently on the pegboard. The finished chairs stood abandoned in the dim light. The amber velvet on the workbench remained untouched. On top of the workbench, pinned beneath a piece of scrap wood, lay a single folded note. Murphy walked across the room. His boots crunched against a stray wood shaving. He picked up the paper with fingers that did not shake. He unfolded it. "Thank you for staying. Now it is my turn to stay for you by leaving. Please do not look for us." The paper was thick. The handwriting was neat and sharp. It was the handwriting of a woman who had spent her whole life fixing things that were broken. Except this time she had broken him. Murphy did not roar. He did not smash the workbench. He stood perfectly still in the center of the silent room. His dark eyes turned into 2 pools of freezing black ice. "Marco," Murphy whispered. His voice was terrifyingly soft. "Boss, find her. Every interstate. Every bus terminal. Every rental car company in the tri-state area, find them before the sun sets. And if anyone else finds them first." Murphy did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. Across the city, in a high-rise office overlooking the river, a phone rang. Salvatore Rizzo picked it up on the first ring. A cold smile spread across his scarred face. "They just crossed the state line into Pennsylvania, boss," the voice on the line reported. "Are the cars in position?" Salvatore asked smoothly. "In position? Good." Salvatore stood up and walked to the panoramic window. "Murphy Moretti thinks he owns the city. Let's see how he looks when the only thing left of his little family is a memory." The trap snapped shut, and the clock began to tick down to absolute bloodshed. The heavy silence of the empty Pennsylvania motel room pressed down like lead. Allie sat on the edge of the narrow bed. Her fingers brushed against Lily's sleeping forehead. The child was breathing softly, exhausted from the endless miles on the bus. Allie stared at the cracked window pane. Outside, the first pale light of dawn began to bleed through the gray horizon. She knew she had done the right thing. She had given up the only man who had ever looked past her scars. She had given up the only home she had built with genuine hope. And yet, her chest felt hollow, carved out by a dull blade. A soft click echoed from the hallway outside. It was not the sound of a key. It was the heavy, calculated thud of a steel boot against the doorframe. Allie's breath caught in her throat. She slid off the bed without making a sound. She pulled Lily behind her legs, shielding her small body with her own. The cheap wooden door shuddered. Once. Twice. On the third strike, the lock blew apart in a shower of splintered wood and iron screws. The shadows poured into the room. The motel door shattered into 1,000 splinters. The cold air rushed into the tiny, dark room. 3 men in dark jackets poured through the wreckage like a pack of wolves. Allie threw herself in front of her daughter. "Lily, run to the bathroom," she screamed. A heavy hand grabbed Lily by the collar of her jacket. The child was yanked backward into the air before she could take a single step. "Got the little bird," a rough voice grunted. Allie lunged forward with a blind, desperate fury. She struck out with her bare fists. She hit the closest man square in the jaw. He staggered back, cursing in the dark. Before she could reach her daughter, a second man caught her from behind. An iron forearm locked around her throat, cutting off her breath. She kicked and thrashed against the suffocating grip. Her vision began to blur at the edges. Through the haze, she saw Lily's terrified face. The little girl was not crying. She was staring straight at her mother with wide, silent eyes. "Quiet, both of you," a cold voice hissed from the doorway. A man stepped into the dim light of the motel room. He wore an expensive gray suit that smelled of stale cigar smoke. A jagged scar ran from the corner of his lip down to his collar. Salvatore Rizzo. He smiled, showing too many teeth. "Mr. Moretti is going to be very interested in this reunion," Salvatore whispered. He snapped his fingers. A heavy canvas bag was slammed down over Allie's head. The world plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. She felt herself being lifted off her feet. She heard Lily's muffled cry cut short by a hand clamped over her mouth. Then the sound of slamming car doors. The roar of an engine tearing away into the gray dawn. Back in Manhattan, Murphy Moretti's private phone rang on his mahogany desk. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. He picked it up on the first half ring. "Speak," Murphy ordered, his voice like grinding stone. "Moretti," a raspy voice laughed through the speaker. "Do you know who this is?" Murphy's hand tightened around the heavy phone. "Salvatore." "I have 2 guests of yours," Salvatore said smoothly. a mother, and a very talkative little girl. The temperature in the private study dropped below freezing. "If you touch a single hair on their heads," Murphy whispered, "I will skin you alive and feed you to the river." "Save the threats for your board meetings," Salvatore sneered. "Here are my terms. Brooklyn, Manhattan, and every dock south of the bridge, signed over by the end of the day. If I don't have the papers by nightfall, the little girl goes first." The line went dead. Murphy stood up so fast his heavy oak chair crashed backward onto the marble floor. He did not look at the chair. He reached into the wall safe behind his desk. 14 men in black coats melted into the rusted iron perimeter. They did not make a sound. They moved like ghosts through the broken loading bays. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with dust and cheap cigarette smoke. Salvatore Rizzo sat on a wooden crate. He tossed a heavy hunting knife from hand to hand. 10 feet away, Allie was bound tightly to an old metal chair. A thick strip of gray duct tape sealed her mouth. The ugly purple bruise bloomed darkly across her right temple. Beside her, little Lily sat huddled against the cold concrete floor. Her small arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her eyes were wide and dry, staring blankly into the dark. "Don't worry, little bird," Salvatore sneered, leaning down toward the child. "Your daddy is going to sign away his entire empire before midnight, and then maybe we'll let you both see the sun again." Allie let out a muffled, frantic cry behind the tape. She thrashed against the ropes, her eyes burning with pure fury. Suddenly, the front of the warehouse exploded. The heavy steel garage doors buckled inward with a deafening roar. Automatic gunfire lit up the cavernous space like jagged lightning. Shouts and curses echoed off the concrete walls. Salvatore jerked his head toward the front entrance. "What the hell is that?" he yelled. One of his guards scrambled toward the back office. "It's Moretti," the guard screamed. "He brought an army." "Kill the lights," Salvatore roared, drawing his sidearm. The overhead incandescent bulbs shattered in a single coordinated volley. The warehouse plunged into flickering strobe-lit chaos. Shadows darted between towering stacks of wooden crates. Gunfire cracked through the damp air. Murphy moved through the smoke like an executioner. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. 2 of Salvatore's men lunged around a corner with raised submachine guns. Murphy fired twice without breaking his stride. Both men dropped instantly. He stepped over their bodies and kicked open the heavy oak door of the side office. Salvatore spun around inside the room. He grabbed Lily by the collar of her jacket and hauled her up. He shoved the barrel of his pistol hard against the side of her soft temple. "Drop the gun, Moretti," Salvatore shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "Drop it or the kid's brains paint this wall." Murphy stopped dead in his tracks, the pistol in his hand lowered by an inch. His dark eyes locked onto Salvatore's trembling fingers. "Let her go, Salvatore," Murphy said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "Not a chance in hell," Salvatore laughed hysterically. "Drop the piece or she dies right now." Allie screamed behind her tape, her body convulsing in terror. Murphy's eyes flicked from the gun barrel to Salvatore's sweat-drenched forehead. He did not blink. His finger tightened slightly on the trigger of his father's pistol. He did not drop the gun. Instead, he raised it with lethal, terrifying precision. "You missed a spot," Murphy whispered. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot roared inside the tiny room like thunder. The bullet struck the exact center of Salvatore's right wrist. Bone splintered. The pistol flew from Salvatore's shattered hand and splattered across the floor. Salvatore shrieked, clutching his ruined wrist as blood sprayed everywhere. Lily tumbled backward out of his grip. Murphy crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He caught the little girl before she hit the ground and swept her up into his arms. He tucked her safely against his chest. Then he kicked Salvatore hard in the chest. The mafia boss crashed backward through the rotten drywall. Marco appeared in the doorway a second later. Clear, Marco panted, his coat stained skull and dust. Murphy ignored him. He knelt down beside Allie's chair. He pulled the hunting knife from his own boot and slashed through the heavy ropes in a single fluid motion. He ripped the duct tape from her mouth. Allie gasped for air, her chest heaving violently. She threw her arms around Mercer's neck so hard she nearly knocked him backward. "You came," she sobbed, the tears finally breaking through. "I told you I would," Murphy murmured against her hair. He pulled both of them into his arms, shielding them from the blood and the smoke. The war at the docks was over. The Empire was safe, and the man who had spent 3 years hiding behind an empty coat had finally found his way home. The morning sun hit the iron lock of the shop door. It was unlocked, tightly open. Allie Restoration hummed with the warm scent of sawdust and fresh varnish. 4 months had passed since the blood at the Newark docks dried. The city had returned to its cold, predictable rhythms. But nothing inside this shop was ever going to be the same again. Allie stood at her heavy workbench. Her hands moved with a quiet, steady grace over the edge of a restored mahogany chair. The scar on her right ribs was just a faint pink line now. The terror of that rainy night had faded into the background of a safe, ordinary life. The bell above the door jangled a bright, cheerful note.